through to Ray Pawson, Emeritus Professor of Social Research Methodology at the University of Leeds, covering the topic of the coronavirus response, a realistic agenda for evaluation. So, Ray, take it away, or Wendy.
Okay. Thanks, first of all, to Jeff and Anna for organising this, and thank you all. I see there are 64 people. Whoever you are, wherever you are, you're most welcome. Forgive me if this might be a bit clunky. Jeff is going to move the slides on, and we've not rehearsed this, and I generally think I might be awful at this. I've only done this once. I know all of the rest of you are busy building your lives around Zoom, but I've only done it once. And incidentally, it was the same day that the Queen, God bless her, tried Zoom for the first time. So forgive me if it's a bit clunky. We'll stay on this slide just for a little bit more, because I want to give you some background. As many of you will know, I retired 6 years ago, easily six years ago, and I set myself the task of writing the fifth book. Not the three, Jeff mentioned three, there's an even better one before all of that began. And this fifth book was going to be called Evidence-Based Everything. An ambitious little effort. The problem was in 2019, evidence-based everything didn't include the dreaded COVID-19, and now I couldn't possibly write a book about evidence without having something to say on COVID-19. So I've set to work over the last few months to try and piece things together, and this little presentation is an agenda. It's an outline of the kind of things that I think that the realist community, that means you lot, can do in relation to the crisis. Next slide, please, Jeffrey. I always like to start in Culture Corner, and I'm so old. We used to have to do Latin at school, and the masters, for that's what they were, used to say that the Romans basically had anticipated everything, and we thought, oh my God. But it turns out to be true. So this is from Ovid, the Romantic poet, and look what he says. Causa latet vis es notissima. Dead right, Mr. Ovid. Next slide, please. Now, this is down to business. What struck me about the science around COVID is it doesn't sound like the science I know, and I think the science that many of you will be aware, the social science, the program evaluation science, which, as a matter of course, sees social change as a complex, adaptive, self-transforming system. And I think it's important to set that backdrop into any discussion of the crisis. And this first slide, first significant slide, tries to do that. It tries to say just how complex is this COVID response. It won't work through every bullet point here, but in terms of things that you were familiar with, realists like to talk about ontological depth, and you have it here with a vengeance. Everything from microbiology, cell transmission, to the macroeconomics of worldwide debt, and all of the institutional and organizational layers in between. All of that is important to understand the COVID response. The other things on this list, I guess you'll be familiar with them. You've got lots of separate interventions. Those interventions might clash, or they might help each other along. routine for an evaluator. The third one's quite interesting. The COVID response, and like I think any other program I've ever looked at, requires more attention to exit than it does to entry. Unlocking is much more difficult than locking down. And so you can go through the various elements, some of which you're completely aware of. It involves long implementation chains. So the route from Whitehall to your local health centre has many stages, and the program adapts on the way down. I won't go through them all, perhaps just mention the last one. Programs are complex adaptive systems thrust into complex adaptive systems. So what happens in terms of COVID influences Brexit, it influences Black Lives Matter, it influences climate change, and vice versa. It's embedded in a huge system. Why I want to start there and pause there quite a lot is, if you take that to be the program, then it makes causal attribution incredibly difficult. I would say impossible. It makes causal attribution in the way that much of the surrounding science wants it to be. It makes that impossible. So I think the conventional response still wants to say there is this intervention and it has these consequences. And I think if you see the intervention as that complex system, that simple idea of causal attribution breaks down. Next slide, please, Jeff. We've looked in this one at the current scientific response, and I've called that the COVID hierarchy of evidence. And basically, what I'm trying to say is, realists, evaluators, program evaluators, social scientists don't really get in a word in edgeways. So if you look at the hierarchy from top to bottom, the science headquarters is SAGE, the splendidly named SAGE, and in the initial stages of thinking about February and March, modelling, the Imperial crew, Ferguson's crew, very much led the science, and that over time has given away to the monitors, the measurers, the people who want to chart the daily shifts in the R number and whatever. And now we're working down the hierarchy. SAGE actually has 7 SAGE committees. It's worth looking at the minutes of these committees, which have been selectively, but only very selectively, released. There is a social science subgroup, and it's called the Subgroup on Behaviours, SPIB, and their remit is just fascinating and also, I'm afraid to say, hopeless. That is to say, the agenda is set at the top of the hierarchy by the modelers and the measurers, and the task of social science on SAGE is to improve adherence. So how can we make people adhere to the guidelines as quickly as possible? So my problem with all of that is social science, as I recognize it, program evaluation as I recognize it, is basically off stage. And there's some very insightful work going on, but it's led, as it says at the bottom of that slide, by practitioners, by investigative journalism, and by fact-checking agencies. So I think there's another agenda which is largely missing, which we cover on the next slide, please, Jeff. So this is my fringe agenda. This is really what I want to talk about. And so basically I'm going to throw off the top of my head 5 strategies, which many of you will recognize as evaluation strategies, realist strategies, and so on, which I think could be usefully added to the scientific mix. I'll simply read them out. I won't try to explain them at this stage. So I want to encourage more organizational learning. I want to drill down much better into the data. I want to recycle evidence much more prominently. I want to do something which sounds difficult, anticipate the unanticipated. And then I think there's some international comparisons which would really benefit from a realist treatment. So the next slides, they come in pairs. So for each one, I introduce the idea and then give a small example. And so we'll start on that routine from now, please, Jeff. So the first strategy, many of you, especially if you've got a health background, will know all about this. This is not so much a research strategy as I think the main vehicle for learning about the virus. As it says, there are hundreds of variations. It's called NHS Improvement. It's called quality circles. It's called learning circles. It's called double loop learning. It's got many phrases to describe it. And basically, it works in two circles. The inner circle representing local learning in response to a problem. So in the NHS, if there's a problem with too high levels of demand, separate local centres begin to learn to do it with this plan, execute, evaluate, change, trial and error. And basically what you can pull together is all of these local case studies and pull them together into a national effort. And through that process, there should be organisational learning. That has happened spectacularly well in one instance, which is on the next slide. So this is about ICU and the learning that's happened in ICU. As you'll remember, if you go back to February, March, there were these dire predictions about the shortage of ICU beds and ventilators. And what do they call them? Nighting hospitals were built in a jiffy. The programs went out to see if these ventilators could be designed and supplied in very quick times. And there's this amazing effort went in. I think McLaren, the motor racing firm, produced a prototype ventilator. So all of that went on, and despite the simulations, none of it was needed, because what went on was ICU learning. That's summarized in the bullet points on the right-hand side of that slide. Again, I won't work through them. The basic one is a more sophisticated triaging system where people entering ICU were subdivided and stratified. So different patient pathways were created through ICE, both literally and metaphorically. So in terms of clinical treatment, a much more sophisticated array was put into place, and a physical pathway was built into the hospital, plus all of those other points and more that are on that slide. Now my point there is I searched to see if I could find this in the expectation that I could, and the first signs of this were from blogs from local centres, from clinicians who wanted to teach each other what was going on. And this kind of bullet pointed list has been formalized, and now you can find it in things like NICE guidance, various bits of NHS guidance, and so on. So that I think is one of the really impressive points in the COVID response. And it was the platform that was important. I think I've said enough on that one. Next one, Jeff. So this is another idea, and this is more it's a technical idea, though a very simple one. We know that COVID. We know we're not all in it together, and we know that there are different situations, different groups, different communities which are much more severely hit than others. And so data is available by the bucket load, which differentiates high and low transmission rates in different situations. What I'm suggesting, and this is a realist subgroup analysis, no more nor less, is a good way to attack that is to say, well, what are the exceptions? So in other words, in the high risk situation, you'll always find groups, individuals, situations which are less high risk. So that within the losers, there will also be winners and losers. Now, if you drill down like that into the subgroup levels, what is revealed are explanations. You develop theories. So this is not mediator and moderator analysis. This is not multiple regression analysis. This drilling down releases theories, releases explanations. An example on the next slide. So there they are, Madge, Mildred, and Mavid in the care home, and this is a little example. I think you'll be familiar with it. I'm not claiming any originality here. It's the methodological lesson that's important. As most of you will know, COVID infection rates and death rates in care homes were shockingly high. We're talking about February, March, April now. And there are plenty of explanations for this, plenty of program theories, if you will. The fact that it was separated from NHS provision, chronically unfunded, staff were poorly paid, social distancing was impossible. So that basic explanation for why care homes did badly was simple enough and probably largely true. But the point was that some care homes remained infection-free. Some were hotspots and some in the green were infection-free. So how do you explain that? And again, I think you'll be familiar with a couple of the explanations. So care homes themselves suffered staff shortages, and there were lots of temporary agency workers who literally flitted from home to home. You only need a couple of super spreaders in that, and that is the basis of higher rates of infection. And the other one, also reasonably well known, was that in order to free up space, hospital discharged many older parents directly into older patients directly into care homes without adequate testing. The point is, the example's fairly well known, but 2 points. One, what you do when you drill down is to develop theory. And the second point is, I think you could do that drilling down with any starting point. You could drill down in Leicester. You could drill down with brown doctors and black nurses. And you'd get more sophisticated understanding if you use that very elementary method. Next slide, please, Jeff. Right, here's some old news. Evidence-based policy, we've talked about it for donkey's years, and it only really makes sense if the evidence comes before the policy. And that's incidentally why I think research synthesis, realist synthesis even, should have pride of place in evidence-based policy. So what might we have known at the very start of the COVID epidemic on the basis of previous episodes. I bothered to look at some inquiries, and each epidemic leads to an inquiry, as this one will. And I read some interesting stuff in that, this idea of the over reliance on modelling, the idea that modelers are not soothsayers. I think it's said in one report I read. I'm not sure about this idea of the direct learning from previous epidemics. I'd like the idea of how you synthesize previous information by looking a little bit more indirectly for evidence. As I said several slides ago, that programs are complex and many-sided, and you can just look at some of the sides, for example. So let's go to the next slide for a little illustration. This is about are there any lessons that we could learn from NHS 111 which would apply to track and trace? Now, of course, they're not remotely about the same thing. 111 is someone ringing up about my daughter Olivia's bottom, the rash on it, and what should I do about it? Track and trace is trying to piece together the trajectories of a virus. Yet there are some commonalities, and the commonality I think is to do with call handlers. But both of them rely on call handlers. So what did we learn from 111? And there are a little list of bullet points there. It was used by the middle class, and particularly the worried well is rather than was. More callers from white rather than other ethnic groups, used significantly less by men, of course, rather than women. The procedures took months to iron out. There were problems with the call handlers who gradually had to be replaced by people with a little bit more clinical backgrounds, and provision remained in the RAS rather than with Serco, whoever it was. Those rather simple lessons, it strikes me, are part of the reason why track and trace is moving so slowly and pathetically off the ground. Next, please, Jeff. Right, this is a fourth standby, absolutely routine for a program evaluator. We know that programs always have unintended consequences, always have perverse consequences. And although it sounds a little bit odd, it is quite possible to anticipate the unanticipated. Why? Because we live in a policy-saturated world. We live in a program-saturated world, and variations of the same programs occur again and again and again, and make similar mistakes over and again. Here's a little example on this slide. If you want to induce panic buying, the best thing you could possibly say is the little statement there from the Prime Minister. Supplies are plentiful, there's no need for panic buying. That statement alone is guaranteed to induce panic buying. So the guy over on my right, you might not be able to pick him out. It's actually Dominic Cummings. Next slide, please, Jeff. So what I'm saying, not with that silly example, is that you can have a program of researching unintended consequences as part of an important response to the crisis. And here's a little example, and it's a real example in this case. This comes from the Jill Dando Institute. I doubt if we've got many criminologists on board today, but the COVID crisis has clear crime consequences, very few of them considered at the start of the epidemic. Again, I won't go through them all, but let's just look at the first. You can bet your bottom dollar that COVID has led to an increase in biocrime. That is theft of online theft of biological tools, data, devices, and systems. Why should that be the case? Well, you just need to ask any computer hacker, when are computer systems at their most vulnerable? When they're new and when they're rapidly developing. So we can anticipate that particular crime will be at its most dangerous right at the start of the epidemic. So with the other examples that I've got down there, and if you're so interested, you could look at the Jill Dender website there, where they have a fully fledged research agenda plus some potential solutions for each one of those. Again, don't be misled by the specificity of the example. I think there are lots of unintended outcomes that could have been anticipated and could have been put to research, but you don't see much of it about. Next and final research research strategy. This one is absolutely classically realist. So I've even given it a name of a research project: Learning Lessons of Lockdown International Comparisons. What strikes me perhaps above all about the current crisis is that broadly the same measures, distancing measures, isolation measures, lockdown measures have been introduced the world over. And they have the same underlying mechanism. You can't spread the virus if you don't have contact with people. So we have the same mechanism applied in most countries, with significantly different outcomes in terms of implementation success, outputs, if you will, and probably outcomes in terms of the spread of the virus. So a project beckons. Why should that be? We start with some provisional theories. Is it because some populations have more highly compliant populations, like China? Some have much more polarized populations, like the USA and perhaps Britain. Is it to do with the implementation? Should implementation rely on persuasion, as it's largely done in the UK, or as in some of India anyway, have lockdowns been applied by coercion? So we start with an elementary, a provisional theory about why that might be the case. And I reckon if we were to have half a dozen, 8 sketches of the lockdown everywhere from Vietnam to South Korea to the US and so on, we could build quite a sophisticated theory of lockdown behavior. I don't have that data. All I've got for you is a final slide. Jeff? Well, I love these two. I think they call this visual data, don't they? I've never really believed in that stuff, but this is a really cute example. That's social distancing in China and the USA, and I think it makes the point really rather well. I love the slide on the left. I suspect it was posed. If you look at the guy in the bottom left-hand corner, I think he's awaiting instructions on the megaphone about about when he can stop. Posed or not, it does raise the possibility of the different types of social discipline in different countries being absolutely vital for the possibility of lockdown. There's a final slide which doesn't say anything at all, but we'll have a look at it. It just says thank you for your attention, and basically to say I hope that the realist community, for there is a realist community, can begin to make some waves. I feel that we've been rather overwhelmed by the modelers and the measurers, and that the basic methodology, the basic ontology of realism means that there has to be a contribution from our community, and that means you. That's it, Jeff.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ray.